going to show you how to build this custom accordion. It will work on any display size. It will involve a tiny bit of JavaScript code, and we're going to go over the main concepts in the end, just as a quick review. Let's get started. Straight away, I'm just going to visit the Challenge Hub and going to download the starter and Figma files. As soon as they've downloaded, just open it up in WinRAR or whatever unzipping software you have on your computer and drag them into your folder of choice. The files I'm going to use are the images folder, the style guide and the index.html from the starter files, and of course the Figma file. To open the Figma file, simply drag it into the home screen of Figma from the folder. Just close off the WinRAR files and open the Figma file up, just so we can quickly review and analyze the design. Doing this will help us in knowing how to structure our HTML, as well as seeing or foreseeing some potential CSS challenges we're going to come across. As you can see, I've done some initial calculations with all these gray boxes I have. The basic concept here is to get some paddings, some gaps, some heights. What I usually start with is literally by drawing some rectangles. They just help me conceptualize and visualize how certain containers will look like. So in this case, I'm just trying to figure out the image container. A bit of thinking. My conclusion was that I should probably have two different parts of images. One would be for the image with the platform and the shadow. That's the part highlighted in red right now. And the other part would be for the box that is actually outside of our main component. I decided to just make sure I don't forget, so I drew up these two rectangles just to remember the HTML containers visually. Once I was happy with my analysis, I decided to go into VsCode. I typed CMD in my search bar and I'm gonna type code space full stop. And this will open up my folder with all my code inside of VsCode. Straight away, I always start by removing all the code I don't need that was left by Frontend Mentor. I just remove all the lines, all the comments, and once I'm happy, I move on to setting up my CSS. In this case, I'm gonna have two CSS files, my reset.css and just my styles or style.css. The next step was to add all the code for my CSS reset. In the description, you'll find the GitHub link to this project, and from there you can get all the CSS reset. I would just really quickly like to explain why I have font size 62.5%, as some people get quite confused by that. I work with rem units. I barely use pixels, but rem units work very similar, but they're just more responsive. And usually one rem is equal to 16 pixels. And if we multiply by 62.5%, we get 10 pixels. So if all the font size is equal to 62.5%, then all the rem units we do will be multiplied by that. So 0.1 rem becomes 1 pixel, 2.4 rem becomes 24 pixels. Our lives just become much easier now. So instead of doing calculations all the time, you can actually focus on the rest of your code that matters much more. And if you're interested in what extensions I'm using Live Server so that we can preview our website as we code it, as well as Colorize, which simply allows us to preview the colors when we input them into our CSS. And finally, I'm using Prettier, which is a code formatter. Every now and then I'm gonna hit Alt-Shift-F to format my code to make it look better. Now that we've set up our CSS files, we can just start working on one of them. Initially, I'm just gonna grab my font. So in this case, we're working with Cum Sans, and you click the link, go to it, select the weight you need, and that would create an import link for you. Just copy and paste it into your CSS file. Then we can start on some variables. Setting up variables is an extremely good practice. Imagine you had to change a particular font size for 100 different selectors. Well, instead of changing every single one of these selectors, you could just change one variable. It just allows your code to be more maintainable and more scalable over time. And overall, it just simplifies your life if you make it a regular practice. To kick things off, let's start with the font family. Because we're using one font for the entire project, we can just send a font family in HTML, and through inheritance, it's going to apply to every single element. Once we've got the font family set, we can start working with the font size, font weight, and perhaps line height. To get all this information, we can go to the Figma file and simply review every single element and perhaps check between the different screen sizes on whether or not the same elements differ in perhaps font size between screen sizes. Once done, we can start inputting the different variables we have. Initially, let's start with the font weights and get the font size of heading, which doesn't change between screen sizes. And then for the summary description and a few other elements, I'm going to be using clamp. Clamp simply allows us to use a minimum size, maximum size, and a preferred size in the middle. The preferred size will usually have something like a view width that remains responsive when you change the viewport's width. The next one I'm about to share is a way to get the perfect clamp code that's as accurate as it can possibly be in terms of responsiveness for that middle value. As you can see, we're changing variables and it's updating, ready to be copied below. So you put the minimum and maximum viewports width, minimum and maximum rem sizes. And if you're following the tip I gave you before on the rem units, you can just leave that 10 pixels as it is there. The next variables to worry about are the colors. We're simply going to use the names and possibly change them slightly and copy the HSL values. Next, we're going to work with Z indexes. As you can see, the different elements are clearly defined with a certain order, certain hierarchy, and especially the desktop one. We have a box, the platform, and the shadow. So we will most likely need 3 Z indexes for this one. When I did this initially, I actually forgot there's one Z index and one color for the background, which is a linear gradient. So I've added them shortly after. It's time to start writing some HTML. Because FAQ sections are usually, well, sections, we're going to use a section with a class of FAQ. Next, we probably want to create the image section, because our pretty much the whole container is split by the image section and the text section. And the image section appears to have 2 images on mobile and still two images on desktop, but as a sibling it will have this little box element I'm dragging around. And the box element has to be separate. So continuing with this section, let's give it a class. In this case, FAQ image container. We're going to create a div inside, and the div will be for the 2 images, main images you could say, for the mobile and the desktop. We're going to be using the picture element. Initially we're going to give it the appropriate class, in this case woman illustration, or however you'd like to call it. And what picture allows us to do is to use a source element to define what image to use based on a specific media query. In this case, we want an image to basically exist until that max view width of 1109 pixels. And then we have a source set of where this particular image is coming from. Then we're going to do the same thing with min width. And this defines the desktop sized image. And as you can see in the link there. And to function, every picture requires an image tag. It's time to test and check if our HTML is actually working. Let's use our live server extension and right click and select open with live server. And now when you expand the window and decrease it, you should see that it correctly displays us different images based on our view width. The next step is to do the same steps, just this time for the shadow image. So we're gonna give it the correct class. We're gonna pass in the sources with the media queries, and of course we're gonna pass in the image. And of course we're gonna create a sibling image for the box, as the box is kind of halfway between the background and our container. I'm gonna use an image with the correct source of the box desktop and give it a box illustration class. The next step is to focus on our text container. This too will be a section, and we're just gonna see we have a heading and then we have a list, it seems. So let's give it a class of text container, add a heading with FAQ heading, put the correct text, and then we're ready to work on a list. We're gonna use an unordered list for this and give it a class of FAQs list. Inside the list, of course, we have a list item. So let's give it a class of FAQ item that will be followed by a section. And we're going to split our card into two parts. Item summary, the thing we see before the item is clicked on, and item detail. In this case, we're going to focus on the summary and add the description paragraph and the arrow container, followed by the image with the class of FAQ item arrow icon. The next step is to create a section for the detail. We're going to give it the class of FAQ detail and just input a text there. You could input a paragraph, but I'm just going to leave it as section. It's completely up to you. Then I'm just going to paste in the remaining list items that I've already coded in with the different information. And finally, to check that all our content and HTML has been correctly written, just going to preview it, and there it is. Everything's there. In order to focus on the images section, I'm going to comment out all the text section for now and work on the images. Now that we're ready with our HTML and we have all the variables we need set up, we can get on with our styling. We're going to start with styling the body first, of course. Let's go with the width and min height first. Display grid and with place item center to position the section in the center. And let's use our background variable as the background. Next step, we are going to style the actual FAQ section. So just to see it through mobile, I'm going to click inspect and set my viewport slightly smaller. And I'm going to comment out the box for now, as that's a desktop issue. Just to see what we're doing, let's start with a background of white. This way we can actually see what we're doing to the card. And we're slowly going to add all the styling necessary. For the section, we're going to use a grid. The 10.4M specifically is referring to the card right now. As per my measurements from Figma, we can see that it's actually 104 pixels that is taken by the shadow image, which is actually stretching from all the way on the top of the card. And of course we've got a little gap, and the max content will be taken by the text container, or text section rather. And of course we have 1 of 4, because right now we just want one column as per the one column layout of the mobile. I'm gonna add the little gap that we'll see impacting later. And we're going to set a width 90 so it's responsive until it reaches 600 pixels of width, which I thought would be big enough for everything. We're going to transition the width slowly as it increases in viewport. Because I like writing my media queries separately, we're going to write the desktop code for our section.faq. I'm going to start the background, grid and gap, add the width, which probably we're going to remove later, and a new min height, of course. I realized at this point that we actually have 2 lines of code we don't need: the transition and the width 90% within our desktop media query. Of course our grid will be slightly different. We're going to have 1 row instead now, which will be 1 of 4, followed by 2 columns. The first column will be for the image container, and we can set a fixed width, as in a design it actually is a fixed width, of course. And the 1FR will take the 920 pixels or 92 rem of a max width. And just to quickly test everything, it seems to be working fine right now. Of course the images are messing up the height, but that's okay, we'll come to that soon. Now we can start coding the image section. So just to recap our HTML, we have a section that's called image container. Then we have a div inside that's main images container. That's going to be siblings with that little box that's actually outflowing in the desktop view. To start coding the image container, I'm going to just add the width and the height. We're still going to make this a grid container, and we're going to place the items in the center, as later on our div along with the sibling box will be placed in the middle or in the center. And now we're going to style the main images container with the 2 pictures. So this is obviously going to be image containers, as it's going to share the space with the box later on. Still width and height 100%. Display grid again, as it has 2 pictures that are more or less going to be centered in the same spot. And the original height, it's taken from the grid above, and the width later on. So 10.4 rem height, and later on 38.8 rem width. So still placing items in the center, and grid with a grid area of images. I'm gonna add the media query for desktop now. And thankfully it's not too complicated. We're gonna have position relative and overflow hidden, as later on in desktop view, if you recall from the Figma design file, our larger images are actually cut off. So the overflow will be hidden and nothing will show outside of our container. But position relative, because it would be very difficult to position the 2 images exactly with CSS grid without the entire container just messing up in its width and height. At this point I thought I would just quickly explain all the grids again, because it can look quite confusing. So I'm going to use the inspector tool for now to explain everything quickly. The first grid is of course our body. It's just to center our section. The second grid is our FAQ section, which houses our image section and our text section. Our images container will house the div with the 2 main images, the platform and the shadow, and of course the box in the desktop view. And of course main images container will try centering the 2 pictures. Apologies if it looks slightly confusing. I really like using grid, even grid within a grid, purely for control purposes. We're going to start styling our images. I'm going to focus on the main images of the woman, platform and the shadow. So I'm going to select the container and every picture inside of it. And I'm going to add our grid area for now. Next I will style the woman illustration image. We have to select the image inside, and that's the way to correctly style the picture element. We're going to add a very specific width based on our design, and a height of auto, which might not even be necessary, but I like adding it for visual purposes. And transform translate simply to get the exact position of the image, along with our Z index of secondary. And then of course for desktop, we have to change it ever so slightly. I'm going to use the width from the Figma file again, using a fixed width for the image. And again, I'm going to use a transform translate to move it to the left. It will look correct as soon as we do the styling for the shadow illustration, the desktop size. And of course, let's finish off styling this for the mobile view and add the Z index lowest, as the shadow will always be on the bottom of all 3 images. And whilst I wanted to do this with grid, I actually had to position the shadow absolutely in the desktop size, as soon as I added this large width, it really messed up my container's width and positioning of the platform element. So for now I'm just gonna set a very generic top and right. Transform translate is what I'm going to use to really position it exactly where I want it to be. And you can always do this quite easily in the browser. All you have to do is select the image, go to the transform, click on the percentage and just scroll up and down. Or if you have a trackpad, just, scroll up and down on that. And you can easily position things in the browser without wasting time guessing. And that's it for now for our main two images. They are more or less positioned exactly how they're meant to be positioned. The last image we have to code is our box image. So let's just uncomment it in our HTML. We can finally see it again in our browser. And let's just add the styling. We're going to select it with our class. For now it's display none. We don't want it shown. But grid arrays image containers, as it shares the same grid with our main image container, the div, if you recall. Let's of course remember to add our Z index to our box image, as it will be on the top, so it's Z index main. And let's add the desktop styling, which will be relatively simple because all we have to do is move the box to the left by an exact amount and ever so slightly up, just to match the Figma design file. And that's it. Our images are done. Since we're finished with our images, let's go to our HTML and uncomment all of our text. To begin styling our text, let's start with the text container itself. It looks like it's going to be a simple flex container. Let's add our padding as per our Figma design file. Flex, and then flex will be column no wrap. And to align our items vertically, we will align item center and of course add a gap between the two items, which in this case are heading and the unordered list. And to just continue styling for the desktop, we're mostly going to change the padding as it's vastly different from the mobile view. Now we can start styling the actual content inside of our text container. Let's start with our heading and add all the necessary ingredients to make it work between font size, font weight and the color of course. And that's about it for the heading. Now we can focus on the FAQs list. It's going to be another flex column and won't need much further code from that. And to start styling individual items, let's start with a border just so we can actually see what we're working with. The cursor will be pointer since we want these items to be clickable on. And the pointer is a good way to suggest that to the user. And finally, let's add some little padding to the bottom. Now we can style this summary, the thing we're going to click on to see the detail. But first, let's hide the detail so we can actually focus on the summary. So max height will be set to 0 and overflow to hidden. Straight away we can start with a font size, just to see the text a little better, and then we can declare flex, which will create this into a flex row, which turns the items into their own individual columns. We're going to add some padding right, as in a mobile view there is a little bit of padding on the right of the arrows. And of course we can transition the font weight, as that's the only thing that's going to be changing when the item is clicked on. When we hover over the entire item, we just want to change the text color to red, just like that. I did just realize that I actually forgot to add a transition of color and 250 milliseconds as well, so do that also. When we click on one of these list items, we actually want to add a class of .active to it. And what this will do is activate some code for one of its child elements. So just to show you how that might look like, select your list item, add the class of active to the end, And now we can try styling something. In this case, let's style the item summary and add font weight bold. And then of course we can quickly style the arrow icon, which the only thing will happen to is we're going to transform it. So when the item is active, then we want the arrow to be transitioned. And in this case, we just want to rotate it by 180 degrees. So it turns upside down, just like that on the right. And after that's done, our summary is complete. Just in case someone might be confused why I'm using this colon is syntax, it's simply so when I read my code, I understand it quicker. And the whole colon is kind of highlights that there's something different about this. And then I'm reading what is it, dot active. So you don't have to use it. You could just write dot FAQ, FAQ item dot active, and that would work perfectly fine. It's completely up to you what you do. I just prefer using is syntax, that's all. With the summary out of the way, we can now focus on styling the detail. To style the detail, we need to see it. So I'm going to show you exactly how we're going to be doing part of a JavaScript. Let's add a max height of, max content. And this will just make our text show up. Yeah, so it's taking the maximum content it requires now. All we have to do is just add this detail, add the line height. The max height will be 0 and overflow hidden. So we have this code above, we're gonna have to delete it later on. And of course, keep in mind that inline styling like this overrules the styling we have in our CSS files. So that's how JavaScript works as well, it adds inline styles. Then of course, let's transition the max height and margin top. And the margin top will appear only when the class of active is added to our FAQ item. So this selector, when the FAQ item is active, the detail is giving a margin top of 1.1 rem, just to space itself away from its sibling of detail. At this point I actually realized that there's a tiny little mistake I made. I added padding straight away, padding right to my FAQ summary on mobile, but actually it only belongs in the desktop. So I'll quickly fix that now. To fix this issue, all we have to do is create a media query and move the padding right into the media query for desktop styling. So we'll just do that now quickly. And of course remove it from the mobile or the default. And that's it. This step, I've ready to add some JavaScript. So let's remove the added styling, so the class of active and the added style of max height, max content. And then we can get into our JavaScript file. Okay, for the JavaScript bit, we're just gonna follow this order of steps. Let's just go through it. Let's grab our items. So to grab our items, we create const items, go to the document, query selector all. We select each list item, and we just pass in the class just to make sure that we're selecting the right thing. And this will return a node list to us, so let's return it as an array. Okay, and then let's actually start by add event listeners to our items that handle an item click. Okay, so array for each, we change this into items in a moment, but for each item we want to add an event listener. We're going to listen for a click, and we're going to take the event object. Event object will allow us to grab the target and eventually grab the actual list item we clicked on. The way we do this is we do e.target.closest li, and whatever we click on now inside of this particular list item, it's going to traverse up the HTML tree and grab the closest list item. Meaning, if we click on this little arrow, or if we click on this paragraph, or just in the empty section, it's going to go up the chain. As such, let's say we clicked on this image, it's going to look at the div, that's not a list item, it's going to go up section, not a list item. Going to go here, yep, list item. it's going to stop here and grab this list item for us. So it's going to grab all of this essentially. Yeah. So now that we have the list item, we can also grab the item detail. Because we've got the entire list item now, we can actually access it, just like we did the document over here, right? So let's do that. And then query selector inside of this clicked item, we're just going to do FAQ item detail. Item detail is the currently hidden part, right? And don't worry about the array not defined, we'll fix that in a moment. Const clicked item active. So here we want to get a Boolean value that returns, is it active? Basically, does it have a class of active, like so? Whoops. Or does it not have that? And in which case it would return false. And then we do that is quite simple. We access the clicked item, check its class list, we check if it contains the class of active. Simple as that. And this will return us true or false. The next thing we want to do is look at this. We're going to remove the active class or add the active class. No matter what happens, one of these two will take place. And the way toggle works like this, it's if the list item does not have active, it's going to add it, right? Like it would be that. And if it does have it, it's going to remove it. But easier to just use toggle, since it's going to happen every single step. One of these two will occur. Okay. And then we can start checking if it does remove the max height. If it doesn't, add the max height. So how do you do that? Well, if clicked item active, remember this returns us a Boolean, then we want to remove the max height. In this case, item detail dot style dot max height is null. That's it. And otherwise, we want to add the max height. We've already done this step. Let's just add the max height. We can actually get the scroll height of the element. And I can actually prove to you that there is something here. So check this out. If I go to my CSS and I remove overflow hidden and save, you can actually see that even though this element has no height, the content still shows up. And the content has a height of its own that we can access, which is very good for us. So let's do that. Let's access that height by getting its scroll height. How much can we scroll through it? Obviously, we're not going to scroll through it, but scroll height can be used for many things, not just scroll dependent things. In this case, it just grabs the height of the content, essentially. And then all we have to do is the reverse of that. Item detail.style.max height, and we're literally setting the scroll height in pixels. And that's pretty much it. And if we save this, and of course if we change this to items and save, look at that. That works nicely. And I actually wrote a slightly more clean version of this code just now. So let me just comment this out, and I'm gonna show you how I wrote it. Okay. So first of all, we start in the end. So this is the function that runs, so we should probably start here. Add listeners to items, and it takes in items, all of this stuff, all the items, and it takes handle item click, which is a function that should look very similar to you. The if checks, the three variables, the toggle. Yeah. But yeah, carrying on. Okay, so add listeners to items, array for each item. We're gonna add an event listener over click, and we're just passing the event to a function. In this case, the callback is handle item click. So let's see what happens. You should be familiar with this code already. The only real difference is that I split the clear item and activate item as its own separate functions, so it's slightly easier to read, and in the future if we add or take away from this code, it's much easier to adjust, simply because you have slightly more control over everything. And what this allows us to do is we're actually grabbing the second item in our array, and we're clicking on it every time the website restarts, as you can see. And if I remove that, and refresh. There we go. Nothing happens. But I figured this might as well just stay, since in the Figma example, it always seems to be activated. So I figured why not. Although, thinking logically, we should probably change to the first one. And yeah, that's it. That's the JavaScript bit done. At this stage, I think it would be nice to just do a little review of our code, just to see like what have we really written. So let's inspect the body first. The body is a grid, of course. It just has one row, one column that perfectly centers its children. In this case, just one child. That's this section. Let's look at the section. The section is currently made of 2 columns and 1 row, with this gap in the middle. You can obviously reflect that in the code here. And I'm not a massive fan of using fixed values for anything, to be honest. I usually like my content choosing how big it is. But in this case, it just works because of the specificity of this design. Everything is so precise and so in a certain spot that I didn't want to mess with it. And so I decided just to stick with these fixed values. And we've got this maxed width, and let's see what that does. If I remove max widths, it just tries stretching up to this width 90%. If we remove that, it's going to be 100%. Let's turn all of these guys back on. We've got this gap working for us, of course. This is pretty like a simple enough grid, I think, to understand. The next section is an image section, which I suppose might seem a bit confusing. Just like a body, it has 1 row and 1 column. And just like the body, place item center. The only difference is we've added actually a grid area here. And we've specified a 1FR row and column, yes? And this, of course, relates to the children here. So the div is going to have the grid area, of course, of image containers that we've specified here, and the box image that we had to lay over the top of this entire section, just so it kind of sticks out like it does in the design, right? And the grid kind of helped us do that, you know, it helped us to get this really strong center start. And the nice thing with CSS grid, of course, helps us overlap things if we want to. This was a slightly weird image solution, but overall I think it came out pretty clean, and I think or hope it's quite easy to understand once you really spend time on it and just try to appreciate what the solution really is. It's mostly using grid, and where it can't be helped, we do use position absolute for one image, in this case the background, the shadow. Yeah. And the rest is quite simple, to be honest. It's all about flex, rows and columns and all that stuff. And of course the JavaScript code we've written. Overall, I'm quite happy with this result. I could improve it in probably 10 or 15 different ways, but at some point when it comes to Frontend Mentor, I like to draw a line. This is enough for now. Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, just leave any feedback you might have below. I would really appreciate it. Thank you. Ciao.